Okay, so you want to run an empire from the middle of a lake. No wheels, no beasts of burden, no iron tools, no ships that ever leave the coast. And in less than 100 years, you build the richest, most feared economic machine in the Americas. That's the premise. That's what the Aztec Empire actually pulled off. Most people think Aztecs. They think human sacrifice, feathered warriors, and a civilization that collapsed the moment a few hundred Spaniards showed up. They see the fall and assume the whole system was fragile theater built on fear. It wasn't. The Aztecs didn't get rich by accident, and they didn't fall because their economy was weak. They built one of the most sophisticated, tribute-based economic systems in human history, ran it without currency, without wheeled transport, and without a single draft animal. And they only fell because that system had one structural flaw baked into its foundation from the start. That's what we're breaking down today: the mechanics, the hidden costs, the revenue model, and the fracture line a foreign invader simply pried open. Before economics, we have to talk about the lake. Because in the Valley of Mexico, the lake was the economy. The Aztecs, or more precisely the Mexica, arrived late to the valley, pushed out of better territory by rival city-states, and settled on a swampy island in Lake Texcoco that nobody else wanted. No good farmland. No defensible high ground, just mud, reeds, and water. That supposed weakness became the foundation of everything that followed. They couldn't farm the land the way everyone else did, so they built land instead. They drove stakes into the lake bed, wove in reeds and branches, piled on mud and decomposing vegetation, and created chinampas, artificial floating gardens anchored to the lake floor by willow roots. Each chinampa produced yields regular soil farming couldn't touch, because the plants had constant access to water from below and a steady supply of nutrient-rich muck the farmers dredged up themselves. Some plots produced up to 7 harvests a year. Compare that to a rain-fed hillside plot getting one. The lake wasn't a limitation the Aztecs worked around. It was an agricultural engine, more productive per acre than almost anything else in the pre-industrial world, and it fed a capital city, Tenochtitlan, that by the early 1500s held somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, larger than most European capitals of the same era. Now the actual engine behind the empire, because it wasn't the Chinampas alone, it was tribute, the Aztec Empire, technically the Triple Alliance between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, didn't function as a unified territorial state the way Egypt or Rome did. It functioned as a hub-and-spoke extraction network. Conquered city-states weren't absorbed, administered, or culturally assimilated in most cases. They kept their own rulers, their own gods, their own local governance. What changed was a single obligation: pay tribute or face the army again. This is the part people miss. The Aztecs weren't running a command economy that owned the means of production the way Egypt's pharaoh theoretically owned every field. They were running something closer to a protection racket at imperial scale, and it worked because the alternative to paying was catastrophic. The Codex Mendoza, compiled after the conquest but based on pre-conquest tribute records, lists roughly 400 to 500 subject towns, each assigned specific tribute quotas on a fixed schedule, some paying every 80 days, some annually. The tribute wasn't abstract. It was itemized down to the unit. Specific towns owed specific quantities of maize, beans, cacao, cotton cloaks, warrior costumes, jade, gold dust, copper axes, and raw materials like rubber and lime. The codex records totals in the hundreds of thousands, over 7,000 tons of maize annually flowing into the capital region alone, alongside more than 2 million cotton cloaks called quachtli over the life of the tribute system. This is where the currency question gets interesting, because the Aztecs, like the Egyptians, ran a massive economy without coined money. They used 2 parallel units of account that functioned almost like a dual reserve currency. The first was the quachtli, a standardized cotton cloak. The second was the cacao bean, and yes, that means chocolate literally functioned as small change across Mesoamerica. A rabbit might cost 30 cacao beans, a slave might cost 100. Large transactions settled in quachtli, small daily transactions settled in cacao. Both had the property that made in-kind currency work. You couldn't counterfeit a cotton cloak at scale, and cacao beans had genuine consumption value, so the currency itself was never worthless even if the exchange system broke down. Who actually moved all of this? The Aztecs had no wheeled carts and no pack animals capable of hauling serious loads, so every item of tribute moved on the backs of human porters called tlamime, walking established trade roads on fixed schedules, organized and provisioned along the way by local kalpuli, the extended kin-based landholding units that formed the base unit of Aztec economic life. On top of tribute sat trade, and here the Aztecs built something genuinely unusual, a professional merchant class called the Pochteca, who operated as long-distance traders, intelligence gatherers, and diplomatic agents all at once, often traveling into unconquered territory to trade for goods the empire didn't produce: jaguar pelts, quetzal feathers, tropical shells, exotic woods, and reporting back on the military and political vulnerabilities of the places they'd visited. The Pochteca weren't just merchants. They were a proto-intelligence service embedded inside the economic bloodstream of the empire, and the state took them seriously enough to grant them their own courts, their own patron god, and their own legal privileges separate from ordinary commoners. All of this converged on Tlatelolco, the twin city fused to Tenochtitlan, home to what may have been the largest market in the pre-Columbian Americas. When Hernán Cortés first saw it in 1519, his own soldiers, men who had seen Constantinople, Seville, and Rome, wrote back that they had never witnessed anything comparable in scale or order. Estimates from Spanish chroniclers put daily attendance at 20,000 to 60,000 people, trading everything from gold and turquoise to firewood, medicinal herbs, and prepared food, with designated sections for each category of good and court-appointed officials patrolling to settle disputes and punish cheating on the spot. This wasn't informal barter chaos. It was a regulated commercial institution with pricing conventions, standardized units, and enforcement, operating entirely without a central mint. Here's where most people's understanding of the Aztec economy falls apart. We assume an empire built on tribute and conquest must have been purely extractive, a system that took and took with nothing flowing back. That's not quite right, and it's also not entirely wrong, and that tension is the key to why the whole thing cracked. Tribute flowed inward to Tenochtitlan, and a portion genuinely flowed back out. Grain reserves were held against famine years, and the devastating famine of 1450 to 1454, caused by drought and then catastrophic flooding, was managed in part through redistribution from tribute stockpiles and emergency food imports secured by the state. But unlike Egypt, where the Nile guaranteed the productive base itself and tribute was really domestic taxation, in the Aztec system the conquered periphery had no ideological stake in the empire's survival. An Egyptian farmer paying grain tax to Pharaoh believed, for most of Egyptian history, that Pharaoh maintained cosmic order that benefited him too. A Totonac, or Tlaxcalan town, paying tribute to Tenochtitlan mostly just resented Tenochtitlan. This is the structural crack, and it was there from the beginning, not something that developed over centuries the way Egypt's temple exemption problem did. The Aztec model: keep the conquered elite in place, extract tribute, but never fully integrate the periphery into a shared civic or religious identity, meant every subject population was a potential defection risk the moment a credible alternative appeared, and tribute demands kept climbing. Aztec religious ideology required an enormous, continuous supply of sacrificial captives to sustain the sun and hold off cosmic collapse. And the Flower Wars, ritualized conflicts fought partly to generate captives, kept relations with neighboring states like Tlaxcala in permanent low-grade hostility rather than allowing assimilation. Tlaxcala, notably, was never conquered by the Triple Alliance despite repeated campaigns, and it sat right in the geographic heart of the empire's core territory, a live demonstration that the tribute system's military coercion had limits, and a permanent grievance waiting for an outside actor to exploit. Let's run the numbers on how the system was supposed to work versus how it actually broke. The optimistic scenario: continuous military dominance keeps every tributary town too intimidated to defect. Chinampa agriculture keeps the capital fed regardless of what the periphery does. Pochteca trade routes keep exotic luxury goods flowing to maintain elite loyalty within Tenochtitlan itself. And tribute income keeps funding temple construction, redistribution during famine years, and the material basis of Aztec state ideology. Under this scenario, the empire's economic center of gravity, a Chinampa system feeding 250,000 people on a lake island, was actually remarkably resilient and could have persisted for centuries, the way Egypt's Nile-based surplus did. The realistic scenario is what actually happened. In 1519, Cortés landed on the coast with a few hundred men, and rather than facing a unified Aztec economic and military bloc, he found a tribute empire whose subject populations had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Tlaxcala allied with Cortés almost immediately, not because the Spanish offered anything economically superior, but because decades of tribute extraction and flower war casualties had left them with nothing to lose and everything to gain from Tenochtitlan's collapse. Totonac towns along the coast did the same. Cortés's forces that eventually besieged Tenochtitlan in 1521 were overwhelmingly composed of indigenous allies, tens of thousands of them, fighting alongside a few hundred Spaniards, specifically because the tribute economy had generated 3 generations of resentment that never resolved into loyalty. The siege itself is a case study in what happens when a tribute-based economic hub loses control of its supply lines. Cortés and his allies cut the causeways connecting Tenochtitlan to the mainland, the same causeways that had carried tribute goods, Chinampa produce, and fresh water into the city for 2 centuries. A city built around a hub-and-spoke tribute and trade network, brilliant when the spokes were secure, became catastrophically vulnerable the moment those spokes were severed simultaneously. Smallpox, introduced by the Spanish and their allies, and to which the Aztec population had no prior immunity, tore through the city during the siege, killing an estimated 40% of Tenochtitlan's population, including the Emperor Cuitlahuac himself, at the exact moment the system needed maximum coordinated capacity. Starvation set in as tribute and trade stopped arriving. Within 80 days, one of the largest cities in the world at that time had fallen. So here's the final accounting. The Aztec economy's genuine achievements had nothing to do with gold or conquest for its own sake. They were structural and agricultural. The Chinampa system remains one of the most productive pre-industrial farming techniques ever devised, sustainable enough that remnants of it, the canals of Xochimilco, still exist and still produce crops today, 5 centuries later. The dual currency system of cacao and cloth enabled complex market transactions without precious metal coinage. The Pochteca merchant class built long-distance trade networks that moved goods and intelligence across a region with no wheels and no navigable rivers comparable to the Nile. And Tlatelolco's market demonstrated that large-scale commercial regulation didn't require a European institutional template to function at genuine scale. But the empire's fatal weakness was not agricultural, and it was not military. It was the same tension every tribute empire eventually confronts, the gap between extraction and integration. Rome eventually granted citizenship to conquered peoples. Egypt's ideology of Ma'at, however imperfectly, offered subjects a shared cosmic stake in the state's survival. The Aztec Triple Alliance never crossed that line. It took tribute, it took captives, and it left resentment to compound with every flower war and every tax cycle. For less than 100 years of imperial expansion, not nearly long enough for that resentment to fade into anything resembling shared identity. When a foreign force finally arrived offering an alternative, the empire didn't fall to superior technology or superior numbers. Cortés's few hundred men were never going to conquer a 250,000-person city on their own, and everyone who has actually studied the conquest knows it. The empire fell because it had spent generations building an economic machine that extracted brilliantly and integrated almost not at all, and when the moment of maximum stress arrived, disease, siege, and famine converging in the same 80 days, there was no reservoir of loyalty left among the people whose labor and tribute had built Tenochtitlan's wealth in the first place. That is the lesson that cuts across the fall of an empire that on paper had every economic advantage: brilliant agricultural technology, a functioning currency system without coins, a sophisticated tribute administration, and one of the largest, wealthiest cities on earth. None of it mattered once the people at the base of the pyramid decided they had nothing left to lose. Durable economic systems are not just extraction machines. They are extraction machines that eventually have to answer a harder question: what does the periphery get in return? Egypt answered that question imperfectly for 3,000 years. The Aztecs never got the chance to answer it at all.